All right, good evening. Welcome to Central Mont Calm. It's week 6, and we're going to be talking about feeding of the 5,000 tonight. So let's welcome Dr. Tom Rundell.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
How's everyone doing? Hanging out? All right. You out there?
Yes. We're here.
All right. There we go. There's a little something. If you have your Bibles, you go ahead and open up to John 6. We're going to be in there. We've only been able to tackle about a chapter a week. So, it's about as fast as we can go. But this one here, I just got to say, I'm going to have a confession moment. I was absolutely stressed out all week over this passage because I started digging, and then you ever dig into something so much that you just get lost in all the details. And I was just digging, and all of a sudden, there's so many Old Testament things that are like connecting to the Old Testament. It's just so many of them that I was just kind of like lost in them all. So I actually had to bring the fancy iPad today to kind of keep up with some things. We're going to be in John 6. This is a really important passage. It's another reason I was stressed out. This is kind of like the central sign that Jesus does in the Gospel of John. There's 7 signs that Jesus does in the Gospel of John. Some people kind of rearrange them in different ways, but the first one we know is the water to wine in John 2. We looked at that one where Jesus declares the death of death. He's going to put an end to the power of death. And then the second one is the healing of the official's son that comes over. His son is near death and asks Jesus if he can cash in on that promise in advance. He does it. The last one. Last week we looked at the third one, which is the healing of the lame man by the pool of Bethesda. And then this week is the healing of the 5,000. And then we have the healing of a blind man after this, and then the raising of Lazarus from the dead, and then also the resurrection of Jesus is the final sign. Some people would say that the walking on water is its own sign, because Jesus does a little water walking kind of a deal right after he feeds the 5,000. And some people just include that in this sign, which I did. But if you take these 7 signs and you start with the water and you end with the resurrection, what you get is a Hebrew writing format where you have an idea, and then you have ideas, you go down, there's 7 of these ideas. The first and the last idea are going to coincide with one another. And then it's almost like you get into outline format. You have point A is on the outside here, and then point B indented. These two are going to coincide with one another. Then you have point C that they're going to coincide with one another. And then you have something right in the middle, almost like a pyramid turned on its side, and it's the central piece. The Psalms are written in this fashion, a lot of the Psalms. Many of the Psalms, so like, Psalm 23, everyone's favorite Psalm, that's a part of a chiastic structure. And it's actually, I think, point C in one of the things. Now, if you look at the healing, or if you look at the 7 signs communicated here, the feeding the 5,000 is the one that it comes to. So we have the water to wine, where Jesus proclaims the death of death, and then his resurrection, where he actually abolishes the power of death. And then you have the healing of the man's son who was almost dead. And then you have Lazarus being raised back from the dead. And those coincide with one another. And then you have the healing of a lame man and a blind man that kind of coincide with one another. And then right in the middle at the peak is this feeding of the 5,000. So it's kind of like this central, it's the central sign that kind of everything rotates around. This writing structure is called chiasm, C-H-A-I-S-M, chiasm. They do this throughout the Bible. And some people think that these 7 signs of John are actually written in that chiastic fashion. So this feeding of the 5,000 is kind of a big deal. So it's actually the only sign, the only miracle that Jesus does that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. So you're not going to find any of the others. Some of the other miracles that Jesus does will be recorded in Matthew and Mark hold it, but Luke doesn't. And John doesn't, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke have it, but John doesn't, and vice versa. This is the only miracle that Jesus does, aside from the resurrection, that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. So all 4 Gospel writers think this is important enough to include it. And John, who has just this totally different writing style than the other 3, also includes that in his gospel. So this is kind of like a central piece. It's important. I was kind of freaked out about it because I was just drowning in information. But I finally got to the point of it all, I believe, and I'll be able to get you some things. There's a whole bunch that I'm not going to be able to touch. And if you wanted to ask questions about what about this and what about that, we'll have Q&A afterwards. So you can write down your questions as we go. But go ahead, open up to John 6. We're just going to look at verse by verse through the water walking, all the way from 1 to the water walking incident. So in 1, it says, after this, after what? If you remember that 5 closed with Moses is going to accuse you. Pharisees, yes, Moses on whom you set your hopes, but if you believed Moses, you would have believed me because he wrote about me. So that's kind of the setup for chapter 6, ended in chapter 5. So after this, after that whole scenario there, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs he was doing for the sick. Now Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now if we could pause here, doesn't seem like that's a whole lot going on. Jesus went up a mountain and sat down. Not a big deal, right? Well, if you really look at how this opened with the closing of 5 and the mention of Moses, you can see here that he is now taking on some of the things that Moses did, Jesus is starting to do. So Moses went up a mountain to meet with God, and he actually brought some of the elders of Israel with him. And now Jesus is going up the mountain. And then it says that he sits down. It's not because he's tired, he wants to chill out or anything. When a rabbi sits down, it means he's about to teach something very important. So whenever it says that Jesus sat down, that's kind of like, better listen up. So in our culture, we have the opposite. Whoever's teaching stands up and y'all are sitting down, right? But if someone from the ancient Near East walked in through those doors, they would have thought, man, there's a lot of rabbis in here teaching one guy. It was just, we're doing it backwards in our culture opposed to these guys. So Jesus sits down. Everyone else is kind of there. But he sits with his disciples. So this brings us back to Moses ascending the mountain to meet with God, and then he brings down the law. So it says in verse 4 that the Passover is near. The Passover is kind of like Christmas is our big deal, right? That's the whole nation. Christmas is the big deal. In the church, Easter is the big deal. In the Jewish culture, Passover is the big deal. This is like their big, humongous feast that they do. And we could, if you ever get a chance to sit through a Seder experience, they're awesome. So many Old Testament allusions are there. So again, the Passover festival is near. Now this is talking in 2 different ways again. The Passover is near means, on a calendar, Passover is almost here. But it's also telling us that the Passover is almost near. Like the official one that Jesus is going to go in chapter 19, he's going to go to the cross at Passover. And so this is kind of like a big deal. It's saying that Passover is near, but not just a Passover, but the Passover of all Passovers is about to coincide upon us. And if you remember, the Passover is all about Moses brought the people of Israel out, led by God, across the Red Sea. They had that Passover meal before they all left. And it was a thing that declared their freedom from, they were supposed to recline, you have the pillow, you recline, you have a whole meal, everything symbolic. But it's supposed to declare your freedom. We're now free from this oppressive nation. Egypt was enslaving us, and now we're free. So that was the Passover. So that Passover is near, but Jesus is going to lead another Passover. He's going to lead another Exodus. This is going to be a huge one. So remember in Isaiah 24, we talked about how sin has this consequence of death. I mean, it's just the whole world is enshrouded in death because of this thing called sin. And we're sitting here and there's no wine. The wine has run out. There's no feasting. There's no anything. Well, then Isaiah 25 talks about how God is going to remove the power of death and bring back the wine and the feasting and the joy and all this other stuff. and wipe every tear from our eye. And that's where Revelation gets that language. So this Passover is going to be an exodus out of the slavery of sin, not just out of the slavery of Egypt. So this is a really big deal. So it's the Passover that Jesus is about to initiate here. So then in verse 5 it says, then when he looked up, he saw a large crowd coming toward him. Jesus said to Philip, where are we going to buy bread for all of these people to eat? He said this to test him, for he knew what he was going to do. Now, if you remember when there was the burning bush in Exodus 3, Moses is going back and forth with God, and he's giving all these excuses about why he can't go to Pharaoh. And he asks him a question, what do you have in your hand? Well, I got, this staff, throw it on the ground, becomes a snake. Remember the story there. So now he's asking Philip. So now we're reading this through that paradigm of the Exodus. We're seeing here now Yahweh in the person of Jesus incarnate is now asking Philip, almost like a what do you have in your hand kind of a question. Where are we going to find food for these people to eat? He knew what he was going to do, so he's testing Philip. So this is where John diverts from the other three accounts, because in the other three accounts, the disciples are the one who's initiating things. Hey, Jesus, should we send these people away? Because, there's no food for them. It's going to take a small fortune to feed these guys. And so that's the way it happens in the other three Gospels. John, however, takes a different route, and Jesus is the one initiating. He's the one saying, hey, where are we going to find food for all these people to eat? So he diverts on that point to John's making a point here that Jesus knows what he's doing. Jesus has a plan in place, and he's acting both as Yahweh in the burning bush scenario, but he's also taking on the role of Moses as being the shepherd of Israel. And so he's kind of leading Philip in this question. And Philip answered him, man, 6 months' wages would not be enough to buy bread for each of them, to even get just a little bit. And one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, well, there's a boy here that he has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. What are they among so many people? So we all know the story of 5 loaves and 2 fishes, right? This is where we're at. Now it's a little more familiar. Now there is an Old Testament allusion to this story that we can pull from. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 9. Now, do you remember Saul, the big, tall, handsome king guy who had a beard? It doesn't say he had a beard. I'm just assuming. So Saul, the big, tall, handsome, bearded king guy, he's not a king yet in 1 Samuel 9. He's lost his donkeys. His house lost his donkeys. If you read in the King James, it's actually kind of comical. But we're going to stick with NRSV today. He lost his donkeys. He's looking for his donkeys. He doesn't know where they're at. So they're approaching a town. It's Saul, and a small boy is with him, a servant. The servant is also the word used for small child. That's serving. So Saul is walking. Well, there's a man of God up in this city. And if we ask the man of God, maybe he'll tell us where the donkeys are. But we have nothing to offer the man of God. We don't have anything to give the man of God. And this small boy says, he reaches in his pockets, because they had pockets and jeans, I guess. And he pulls out a small silver coin. He says, well, I just have this, little shekel here, a quarter of a shekel. Perhaps this will do. And so this small boy makes an offering to give to the man of God. And this is really neat, because in 1 Samuel 8, God has already met with Samuel to prepare him, because the people have demanded a king. They want to be like the other nations. They want a king like all the other nations. They don't want to just be led by Yahweh. They want a king, and they want to be just like the other nations. And it breaks God's heart to hear that. And so let's pick Saul. They picked Saul. In 1 Samuel 8, God warns them. First, he warns them of what it's going to be like to have this kind of king. If you want to be like other nations, here's what it's going to be like. In 1 Samuel 8, it says, these will be the ways of a king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots to be his horsemen. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and reap his harvest and make his implements of war. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers. He will take your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys, and will put them to work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. So the people here, they chose an earthly king according to the earthly patterns of having kings and rulers. And God warns them, saying, you think this is going to deliver you, but it's actually going to enslave you. You think you want this, but it's not going to lead to anything good. So here is Israel in the time of Jesus. They're under foreign rule by Rome, right? They've been under foreign rule since Babylon came in and took over. They've been under foreign rule on Babylon, in Persia, in Greeks. And then they took over and had the Maccabean revolt, and they were under their own rule, but they were even enslaved in themselves. It was awful. And then Rome came over, and now they don't like Rome. So God is saying, I will not deliver you from Rome. Because remember that time in 1 Samuel 8, when I warned you about a king, you're going to say you want to be delivered from this. And God, he's saying, no, I will not deliver you, but I will deliver you from something greater, your enslavement to sin and the resulting death consequence. So that's what Jesus is going to do. So they're coming to him, the people of Israel are coming to him and saying, are you going to initiate the earthly kingdom of Israel and take over as king, and we'll all be, your right-hand dudes, and then all the people will come and be our servants and slaves, and it'll be great. And Jesus is saying, no, I'm not going to liberate you from Rome, but I am going to liberate you. I'm going to lead an exodus out of this sin enslavement that you're trapped in. But I'm not going to deliver you from Rome, because it says in that day you're going to cry out to me because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. So now, fast forward back to John. We're back in chapter 6. We have this boy that produces 5 loaves, 2 fish. And we read the 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? But what are they among so many people? There's 5,000 people there. So Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now, didn't we just say that only rabbis with authority sat down in teaching? This one confused me. I was like, why is Jesus making everybody sit down now? Because he was sitting there teaching in authority, and now he's asking everyone to sit down. The actual Greek word for sitting when Jesus sat is different than what Jesus asked these people to do when he asked them to sit. 2 different ways of sitting. The word used here to sit down means to recline. Where do you recline? The Passover table, right? At the Seder. You're supposed to lean on your left side, have a pillow under you, and eat with your right hand. So Jesus is asking them to recline. And there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Now I was thinking, no big deal, right? Grass. You go outside in the summertime all the time, there's grass all over the place around here. Not so in this culture. They're in a desolate place. The only time there is grass is in early springtime. When the spring rains come, they hit, it makes green grass, and then it moves on. So this is like the only time of the year that they're going to get green grass. Everything else is going to wither and dry later on. So this is a reference to the time of year, and it's also a reference to the time of the age. The crucifixion is approaching when Jesus is going to be withered away on the cross. Green grass is happening right now. Things are kind of nice, but the crucifixion is approaching. The Passover is approaching, the big one. So Jesus asked all the people to recline. Now, I found this on a Jewish how to do the Passover site that was rather official, I promise. It says, during Passover, one reclines so you see himself as if he was just now left the Egyptian slavery. So you recline because you're picturing yourself leaving the Egyptian slavery. You're just fresh out of there. Hence, when a person eats on this night, they are required to eat and drink while reclining as a sign of freedom in the manner that kings and the important people eat. So you're supposed to eat like a king on this night. You're supposed to eat in freedom. You're no longer under a foreign oppressive system. You're no longer under the rule of Rome. You're now set free. You're reclining. Jesus asked them to recline in freedom and to act like kings, to act like important people. So a student eating in the presence of the teacher, however, would only recline if the teacher explicitly permitted them to do so. To come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again up into the mountains by himself. If you remember in Exodus, that actually happens. They don't want to make Moses king, but there's this feast that Moses takes the 70 elders and some people, they go up the mountain and they have this whole feast in the presence of God. It's in Exodus 24, 9 through 15. But then Moses is drawn up higher into the mountain, and that's when he receives the law. And then he comes down to give the people the law, and oh, geez, you got a golden cow. What'd you do? So Jesus is retreating from the people's desire to make him an earthly king according to the earthly rules, just like Saul. He's running away from that. Now, this is the temptation that Jesus tempted him with, that Satan tempted Jesus with in the desert, if you remember. Here's all the kingdoms of the earth. They can all be yours. And Jesus resists that temptation because 1 Samuel speaks of the consequences of an earthly king. He's going to be caught up in earthly politics, earthly values, earthly strings being pulled on him because you have this going and that, earthly expectations. And God's kingdom is all set apart from those. Those molds, they want to take this mold and they want to jam Jesus into their mold and say, there we go, cookie cutter God, look at that. But the last time they attempted to put Yahweh in a mold, what came out? A golden cow. That's what happens when you try to stuff God in a mold. Always an idol pops out the other side because you can't contain the mystery of God, the amazing immensity of God. And Jesus is saying, I'm not going to be shoved into that kingly mold that you want me to do. I'm doing something different. But the sign's not done yet. It goes on. Some people think this is a different sign altogether. I think it's tied in. Here's why. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. Jesus is up in the mountains. The disciples were like, hey, let's go down to the sea. They got in a boat and they started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. Automatically, I'm thinking Red Sea. Because what parted the Red Sea? It wasn't Moses' staff. Boom, right? No, he was sitting there, he was praying, and then a strong wind came and all night blew on the Red Sea and slowly parted it over like 12 hours or so, and then dried the ground so this strong wind blowing on the sea. Thinking Red Sea in my head, we're crossing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near to the boat, and they were frightened. So Jesus is up the mountain, just like Moses was, and the disciples depart. And it doesn't tell us why. This is one that bugged me. So you go home and study this one. You tell me why. The disciples left without Jesus, and Jesus didn't tell them to go. I don't know if that's good or bad, but they run into a storm. They left without Jesus, and all of a sudden, bam, a storm hits. Jesus didn't say, hey, go, I'll see you in a bit. John doesn't say that. They just left. And I don't know why. So that's one thing that's bugging me. Perhaps John wants to show that the impatience of the Israelites waiting for Moses to come down the mountain led to making the golden calf. But now the impatience of the disciples waiting for Jesus to come down gets them into trouble. I don't know. That was just a guess of mine, but I'll throw it out there. But when we do attempt to shove God into these earthly molds or expectations or systems of thinking, out comes the golden calf every time. And I wrote this today. It's probably going to be in my book. God is free, wild, and mysterious. And we have attempted to contain God in our boxes and expectations. And God, while never contradicting his revealed truth, is always far greater and mysterious than a human brain can hold. So here Jesus comes walking on the sea. There are some instances in the Old Testament with Moses, with Joshua, with Elijah, and with Elisha, where they part waters and they go across on dry ground. None of these guys ever walked on the water. I think it's because Job 9:8 says, who alone stretches out the heavens and tramples on the waves of the sea. I mean, it's God. God alone is the one who does that. I love that little verse. So God alone, he comes walking on the sea, and they're thinking in their minds, oh my gosh, it's either a ghost or it's Yahweh. Here he comes, because of Job 9. But then Jesus says to them, it is I, do not be afraid. And then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately, like, bam, the boat just arrives to where they were going. Just in an instant, they were transported. But this, when Jesus says, don't be afraid, it's me, I love the phrasing in the Greek. It says, ego eimi, I am. So he just says 4 words, I am, fear not, in the Greek. It's just, I am, fear not. And the I am is right out of Exodus 3, the declaration from the burning bush. Who shall I tell them is sending me? Tell them I am is sending you. I am who I am. I will be who I will be, is another way to put that. Or I will be when the time is needed. I will be who you need me to be in that moment, is another way to put it. Now, if you jump to verse 47, Jesus kind of sums up this whole event with these words. He says, very truly, I tell you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they all died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I give for the life of the world is in my flesh. So Jesus here is saying, I'm the manna, the perfect manna, the spiritual manna that feeds your soul exactly what you need. So you need to believe. And if you believe, then you already have eternal life. Because when you believe, you're eating from the bread, and now you're existing in a different, spiritually, you're existing in a different way. You'll find that when you believe this prophet with a capital P, he says, follow me. That prophet says, follow me. And you'll find that when you believe, you've already crossed over into that new creation that God is bringing, that God has initiated. And it's not an earthly kingdom according to the patterns of the world and the value systems of this world, but a heavenly one according to God's truth. So those who believe, and the word believe in John is most of the time a verb. So those who live in action in a brand new reality with a whole new value system, you're born anew into this world, into that life, into eternal life. And the more of your life that you crucify in this realm, the more that you're born into that next one. So the more that you die in this world, the more you're alive in the next, even though your body is still here. The next one becomes more real than this one. And it's a reality, it's the driving vision, it's the burning passion in your heart. It becomes the be thou my vision is like, that's a plea for us. And the only way to get that vision and to grasp our vision is to go through the crucifixion of our flesh. So when you crucify your greed or your lust, then you find that the pattern, when you crucify something, resurrection, you have a resurrection of generosity and patience. When you crucify your wrath and hatred, you see a resurrection of kindness and sacrificial love. When you crucify your pride and envy, you see a resurrection of contentment and peace. And so when you die into this world and those value systems, greed, lust, wrath, hatred, pride, envy, and there's a million more of them, you start to gain new systems of thinking, new ways of looking at the world, and new value systems to process with. And you have contentment, you have peace, you have kindness, you have sacrificial love, you have generosity, you have patience. These things start coming alive in you. And it's not about a list of you're supposed to do these things and you're supposed to stay away from these things so much as it now is it's just the way that you see the world. It's the way that I operate in the world now. And they take root in your heart. It spills over then. This life is in you. It becomes a river flowing out of your soul. I love the picture in Revelation where it talks about the temple of God has a river that goes out and the river heals. There's these trees grow on the side of the river and the leaves are for the healing of the world. That's like your life because you're the temple. So there's this river of God flowing out of you. And that river, it goes, wherever that river goes, it touches something, it heals something, it brings something else. And it's not by bringing an objective doctrinal truth to somebody who had a wrong, erroneous view of objective doctrinal truth out there. It's not like that. It's that they're seeing a different way of operating in you, and that it's so real to you, and that then they say there's something different about this person. It's not that they're just really moral, or they have a lot of willpower, or that they're just, really religious or churchy or somewhere spiritually something. They're saying this person sees the world in a radically different way. And there's something about them. There's so much contentment there. There's so much peace there. There's generosity there. There's something there that is going to then heal the world, because your presence in the world then spills over into the world. But if you take your expectations of what Christianity should be doing and what Jesus should be providing and how God should be working, and then you attempt to crown Jesus king according to those rules and your own molds that you've made, then you find that all you have on the other side is this golden calf and some tablets of law. And then that's really hard to live by. It doesn't conquer the death. It doesn't conquer the sin. It just makes you look, like you got life together, but your spirit on the inside is dying, and there's no life to offer people. They just say, well, it's a real moral person. They're a real religious person. They're really nice, but you're not quenching anybody's thirst. You're not meeting anybody's spiritual need. You're not living bread, because when Jesus broke the bread and handed it out, and then he pours out his blood for us, not only is communion a remembrance of what Jesus did, but it's a declaration of the mission of the church, because you're his body, right? And so at one time, we're remembering what Jesus did, but then at the same time, we're remembering what we're called to do. We're called to become the broken bread and the poured out wine for our communities. And so Jesus came to lead this exodus out of sin, cancel the consequences of death, lead us out of this Egypt we found ourselves in, and set us loose into freedom. And that's kind of like the whole purpose of the feeding of the 5,000. It's the whole plan of the new kingdom that God is bringing into this world that you're now living inside of. So that's a little bit of what the feeding of the 5,000 is all about. There's a lot more that he couldn't put in the little time here, but why don't you process for a moment? If anyone out there in internet land had any questions, shoot Liminal Living a message. If y'all had any questions, that was a lot to swallow. You can throw them my way. I need to take a water break.
I thought it was interesting that you said that it's the only one that's in all four Gospels. All the Gospels are written by different authors with different audiences. Their intention, their overarching intention is the same, but they had lower intentions that were directed specifically at the needs of their audience. Yes. Matthew writing to the Jews about the king, and Luke writing to Gentiles. And so you see these different intentions in there, yet this is the only sign or miracle that's consistent across all four. So what is it about this one, do you think, that speaks to every person? Because there is a lot of Old Testament symbolism there. What is it about it that makes this one still resonate with the Gentiles so that Luke would include it? Why was it in all four? What is it about it that makes it kind of transcend the ethnic and cultural issues that you're going to find when you're trying to encapsulate the life and ministry of Christ?
That's a good question. Now, I believe it is Matthew and Mark include a feeding of 4,000, or is it Luke? Matthew and Mark. The feeding of the 4,000, there's 7 baskets left over. And then the feeding of the 5,000, there's 12 baskets left over. And so those authors take on Jew and Gentile with those two feedings. That this is an exodus for the Jews, the 12 tribes of Israel, and then the Gentiles, which were symbolized in the 7 nations described in Genesis. So the number 7 in that instance is going back to the 7 nations that were inhabiting the land of Canaan. So Jesus is saying, I'm leading an exodus of sin and death. And in Matthew and Luke, there's 2 different instances for Jew and Gentile. But here, I believe Luke has the fishes as well, and John has the fishes. He does, instead of the feeding of the 4,000 to include Gentiles, he does the fish, the 2 fish. So there we have the Jew and the Gentile coming together to have one feast for God with 12 baskets of bread left over. So this is an exodus out of sin that has enshrouded the entire world. So that's kind of like the inclusive part. This is for everybody. And then the authors handle it differently, but they're communicating the same thing. This is like the central miracle that's covered in all 4. And it is the new Exodus, and Jesus is the new Paschal sacrifice. It says in John 19 that he's presented to the people right at the same time that the lambs are being presented, and he's sacrificed at the same time that the Paschal lambs are being sacrificed. So it's very possible that when Jesus cried out, "It is finished," on the cross, they were blasting the horn for the temple sacrifice. And when he heard that that lamb was sacrificed, and then his blood was sacrificed, then he is overruling the entire sacrificial system at that point and saying, I am the Paschal lamb for the whole world, for everyone. So did that speak to that? Did it bring up any other questions about that? Yes.
Whoa, you're so deep. But, okay,
Sorry.
because this becomes very spiritual. You keep saying this, and I've heard you say this several times. John 1, he talks about believing you're already entering into that eternal realm, which is spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then that one week you said, whom shall we fear? I mean, though we're persecuted, nothing's going to happen. I mean, though we died, we're already into that spiritual of eternity. God's timetable, not the timetable given to this poor terra firma, right? Is that?
Well, there is a spirit realm, an eternal realm.
Right.
At the end, it's married to the physical.
Right.
And that what is now true of us there, sanctification is making true of us here. And then the resurrection will finalize it. And it'll be for the whole creation. Right.
Right. Well, but throughout the New Testament, it talks about what our war is against principalities of the air, which is spiritual. So the fallen realm, which is spiritual, they don't, I mean, besides the Nephilim, they did not have solid bodies or fleshly bodies, right? So when we get persecuted and we're in a dark situation in our life, by believing and holding on to that, we see the eternal light. Is that correlation?
Well, that's the whole message of Revelation. I mean,
right.
The whole message of Revelation is to the 7 churches being persecuted by Rome. And the revelation means it's a lifting. It is a peeling back to get a glimpse into what's actually happening behind the scenes. And so, yeah, you're being martyred, you're being persecuted, you're being chased down like dogs. But look what's happening behind the scenes. And, you have these elders casting crowns and falling before the feet of Jesus. And so it's a peeling back and saying, look what's really real. And if you actually take John and Revelation and overlap them, they follow a lot of the same outline. I think Revelation came first. I mean, there's some dating issues with both of these, but I think Revelation comes first, and then John comes second in the dates. And I'm kind of doing a study of this because I want to study Revelation soon. But there is a spiritual realm, and it's very real, and it will be married to this one. And there is another spirit realm of evil there's a war going on. Ephesians says that we're not battling flesh and blood. So I think that's one of the points of Revelation too, is let's peel it back. You're fighting Caesar and these guards and centurions, they're killing you. Let's peel back and see the actual battle going on behind the scenes. So that world becomes very real to you when you're not in a weird kind of a way. It's just that life of heaven becomes real to you in this one, to the point where you bring it into existence. You know, you're bringing it into reality. You're ushering in the kingdom of God with the way that you're living in the present. So you're, as I said, your physical body is catching up to what Jesus had made true of your spirit. You're already justified, Paul says. You're already past condemnation. You're on the other side of the judgment day. You've already had that verdict. Now, how much of your physical life are you going to dedicate towards, you know, having it fast forward and up to that point? Can you rewind the present and come back and have it? You know, Hebrew thought is, well, Greek thought is that my present determines my end. You know, if I believe in Jesus here, then obviously good things are in store for me later. Hebrew thought is the other way around. What's true of me, what God has declared true about me is influencing my present. And so it's like a reversal. I think they're both true. I mean, yeah, there's a good relationship between East and West thought in that one. But we tend to favor one over the other. So.
Well, and you notice, like, when he gets in the boat, and Job, in Job 1 and 2, it talks about, you know, fire comes down, there's all these elements. And when he calms the sea, they say even the wind and the sea obey. And then every time he goes to kill somebody, there's that demonic representation there. That he, like, even the demons obey.
Not every time, but yes, often.
But majority of the time, you hear that.
Yeah.
Like the kid that gets thrown in the fire, and he's demon possessed. The lame man, you know, he was lame from birth. You know, and then they accuse him of being casting out a demon with a demon.
Mm-hmm.
So the Hebrews there would have that spiritual realm of the fallen angels that's causing this sickness. So I mean, is it or you know, I mean, in John 1:5 he talks about the darkness. He came and they didn't even perceive the darkness, and he was the light. And he refers to it several times about, you know, they're so darkened that they don't even see that the light is there.
Yeah, and you know, that conversation is like a whole other message series that we could go down of, like, but we don't have time to cover that whole aspect of, and the Bible is not explicitly clear on how much influence the spiritual has in the physical world and vice versa. The Bible is not clear about that stuff, but it's really neat to study. We don't have time for it tonight, but maybe in a small group or afterwards we could talk more about that. Any other questions?